Hello and welcome everyone to the Retirement Living Council briefing. We thought we'd continue these online briefings which we started last year during 2020 as a way of keeping connected with you as members and also being able to give you the latest updates on what's happening in the sector. I'm Emma Ashton and I'm the National Policy and Stakeholder Manager for the Retirement Living Council, and it's my pleasure to host today's briefing. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Property Council of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. Look, before we kick off the briefing, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. We're going to have 220 members tuning in to today's briefing, and this is an online event. Unlike Zoom, you can't put your hand up or speak or raise your hand, but we do want to give you the opportunity to ask questions, which you can in the Q&A button, which is at the top middle of your screen. So please submit your questions there and hopefully the panel will be able to get to them. If we don't get to them, we'll try and answer them after the briefing for you. Look, we're really excited today to bring you a briefing about unpacking the recommendations of the final report of the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety. You know, it's 148 recommendations, 8 volumes, but lucky for us, we have Amber Cartwright, Director at Ansell Strategic, to give us this briefing and basically be able to drill down into what the key recommendations are for the retirement living sector. After she briefs us, she'll then be joined by a panel, Helen Emerson, CEO of Southern Cross Care, New South Wales and ACT. She's going to be moderating the panel, which will include Arthur Kumakelis, partner at Thompson Gear Lawyers, Beverly Smith, Executive General Manager of Residential Communities for Australian Unity, and Judy Koo, Manager of Operations at Ansell Strategic. I'm going to get the briefing going. I'm pleased to now introduce Amber Cartwright. And a reminder to our audience, please submit your questions anytime during the session. Welcome, Amber, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that introduction. I'll just start to share my screen. We've now had the Royal Commission report and their final recommendations for just over a week, which has given us a bit of time to start to think about what does this mean for the sector, for consumers and for the regulator, and also other people that are not necessarily directly in the system. I think one of the things that we saw as a result of the report coming out last week was 2 different angles from the media, or 2 areas which they really touched on. And the first was around the disagreement between the 2 commissioners on some of the recommendations that were presented, and then also on the response by the government to the report. Now, I will touch on both of those throughout this presentation, but I did want to just, I suppose, highlight quickly that whilst there was some disagreement between the 2 commissioners with the findings, I think when you start to really go through the 8 volumes and 148 recommendations and the commentary that supports them, is that they really were on the same path, and they really do want to end up at the same destination point, which is around creating a new aged care program. And so that's where I'll start today, is what this Royal Commission and what their recommendation is proposing through Recommendation 25 and Recommendation 1 is to create a new aged care program, which is to integrate all the different services that we have in the sector, bring them into having this single assessment and funding framework that is driven by a needs-based system. And now this is a fundamental shift on how we have done aged care in the past in Australia. When we look at how our systems currently work, we know that home care and residential aged care and CHSP and all the other programs and retirement living sitting there on a tangent don't really talk to each other. And it makes it really difficult for consumers to navigate through it. It makes it difficult for providers to help people to go through the system or to compare how those areas are working. And so we're really excited about those 2 recommendations around having a new aged care program which is supported by a new Aged Care Act. And I think, there's another 146 other recommendations, and we don't necessarily agree with all of them, but if this is the target, if this is what we work towards, we're really happy, and we're certainly on the same page there. Now, the first area that really popped up in terms of that disagreement between the two commissioners was around system governance. And what we saw here was two different models being proposed. So Viper Goni was the independent model, which is very similar to the NDIS. And then Commissioner Briggs was proposing to have a government leadership model. Now, if we had the time and the money and the systems, etc. in place, I probably would also support an independent model. But when we look at how long it took to introduce the NDIS and how many problems were associated with that, it's not necessarily the path that I would want to go down. So just to draw out on that NDIS example, the Productivity Commissioner report was back in 2011. It wasn't until 2013 that it was legislated, and then it wasn't until 2018 that it was finally rolling out in WA, because WA is wait a while, always the last one. But there was a lot of issues even with that time frame. So that was 7 years in itself in terms of from starting that review to rolling it out everywhere. There were so many issues associated with ICT, with making sure there was continuity of support. There was NDIS participants taking the NDIA to court over their funding that was allocated to them. There was workforce capacity issues. And when they really delved into what those issues stem from, they felt that it was still too rushed, that even though it was over a 7-odd year period, it was still too rushed. And so that's something that I'm concerned about. If we go down this path of creating a whole separate entity, we're probably going to be focusing too much effort rather than what Briggs is proposing is to build on the work that the department has already been doing over the last few years to improve that system and improve that bureaucratic body, and hopefully we can build on that and use that as the system going forward. So that'll be, I suppose, an interesting one to see how the government goes down that path. I have a feeling they're probably more likely, the Liberal government's probably more supportive of the government leadership model. In terms of services that they are proposing to introduce under the Royal Commission recommendations, it's really around simplifying what is offered and making it a needs-based focused. Now, the Royal Commission used the words in their report to describe the system as piecemeal, and I could not agree anymore. I'm sure people on this call have either in their professional or their personal experience had to go through the aged care system and try to navigate it. And I'm not just talking about trying to use my aged care. I'm talking about trying to understand what are the services that are actually available, what services would best suit my need, how do I know that that service is available? And there are so many. Just to list off a few, we've got obviously residential aged care and home care packages and CHSP, which everyone would know, but then you've also got short-term restorative care, you've got transitional care, you've got MPS, you've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs, you've got flexible care. There's just a whole raft of these different programs, and it's hard to know where you should go or what service you would need, which would best help you to achieve the quality of life that you're aiming for. So what they're proposing is that we simplify these service categories into 5 broad categories, and that is residential aged care, care at home, social support, respite care, which can be in residential aged care, your home, or in a cottage setting, and then finally to have assistive technology and home modifications as an offering. So I think that's definitely a recommendation I'm all for. I can't even remember all the other systems and I work in this every single day, so I don't know how a consumer or their representatives would go trying to navigate a system as it is today. Now, in terms of actually executing and delivering on these services, the other big shift that they're proposing is to really move away from the supply caps that we have in place today. Now, unfortunately, in Australia, we have traditionally overinvested in residential aged care. So when we look at the statistics, more than 6% of older Australians live in residential aged care. And if you compare that to OECD countries, they're at about, say, 3 to 4%. So we have been, I suppose, we've got people that are going into residential aged care too early, staying for too long, and too many people as well. And when we also break down some of the statistics, we also spend too much in that space because we've obviously got a high proportion of people there. So our spending between home care and residential aged care services is more at the 80-20 mark, where a lot of OECD countries that are starting to lead the way and move towards a home care based system, they spend about 50-50. Now, these recommendations and what the Royal Commission is proposing to do is to start to really address where do people want to be. People want to stay in their home or their community for as long as possible, and so they want to remove the aged care provision ratios, which are a very rudimentary way of allocating out the bucket of money that we have and has really resulted in the piecemeal and the homogenous service that we have today in Australia. Now, the other part that they're looking to do to try and align the system with what people need and want is also making a huge investment into home care services. So they want to change the way it's funded. So part of that is increasing the amount of funding that you would be able to receive in home care to match what you would be able to receive in residential aged care. So that's a huge shift. If we're talking about just from a care cost component, say in residential aged care, average ACFI, you'd be getting between $60,000 to $70,000 a year from that revenue. Whereas if you were a level 4 package, you're sitting at the 40,000 mark. That's a huge jump and will really help people to stay at home for longer if they can. The other part is that they want to remove the wait list. So everyone on this call, I'm sure, is quite aware of the 100-odd thousand people that are sitting on the wait list waiting for their approved package. Now, the Royal Commission has proposed that we remove this wait list by 31 December this calendar year. When we first got hold of this recommendation last year, because it was proposed by Council Assisting, we worked with Bev, who would be on this call later today on the panel from AU, and from Australian Unity and Bolton Clark, just to understand from their perspective as huge home care operators, how would you be able to add another 100,000 packages to the system? Could the system do it? And what we found is that it's very risky. At the moment, the government is only rolling out, say, 1,200 odd packages per week. So we're probably not going to hit that target anywhere at that rate. But on top of that, we found that it's really just pushing the burden to the supplier in this instant. They're the ones that need to build up the capacity of their organisation and their workforce. And when you read through all the other recommendations in the report, you can see that what they're also proposing is that we need to do a lot of work in terms of building up the organisation's capacity and building up the workforce capacity. So if we did roll out the extra 100,000 packages, we'd be talking about an estimated 15,000 care workers that we'd need to find in the system, and then another 15 million care hours as well to deliver on those 100,000 packages. We 100% support getting rid of the wait list, but more support, I suppose, moving and transitioning away a bit safer. The next area that I wanted to touch on was quality. When you look at the Royal Commission over the last 30 months and the hearings and the research reports that they had commissioned, we obviously expected some big recommendations in this area. There was lots of, the first interim report was really on a tale of neglect, and a lot of their hearings were talking about instances of misconduct and abuse, etc. So we expected to see some big recommendations here, and the ones that I wanted to, I suppose, touch on were things that I think are quite important. One, the star rating system. We've seen this system being used in a few different countries. So in some US states and in the UK, they use a star rating system. I can see the appeal to a star rating system. We live in a world today where absolutely everything is rated. I'm sure if any of you go to a restaurant, you would be Googling that restaurant before to see what rating it's getting. That's just the way that we work today. So I can see the appeal for it, but I also think it's got to be done right, because it's fraught with danger about how you measure a business, which is about people looking after people, and it's a very personal business. So I see consumers would love it. It opens up, it makes it a bit more transparent. And again, as I said before, it's already very difficult for consumers to navigate the system as it is at a time when they are, physically going through a journey, personally going through a journey, and then to also have to add another complexity about how do we choose the right provider to meet their needs. This, I suppose, would help to give another layer of information or another tool to help them to make that decision. The other element is around benchmarking. So I think this is also a good recommendation. If we had to make a comparison, I suppose, to some sectors, one being the health sector, is we do not have a lot of open benchmarking data available. Yes, there's different organisations that collect it and compare it, etc. But across the industry, we don't do it very well. So I think there's a great opportunity here to start to get some better information to help inform our decisions that we're making. I don't personally, as part of my day-to-day job, but Judy, who will be on the panel later, she does spend a lot of her time working with different providers about, particularly in this clinical governance framework part, around collecting data, using that data, interpreting that data to make better decision and to deliver better quality care. So I think huge opportunity there, and excited about that one. The final one is the new quality standards. So many of you will be aware that we only just implemented some new quality standards back in 2019. Now they are the commissioners are proposing that we adopt the health sector quality standards, and they be adapted for the aged care sector. I can again see the appeal there when you start to read their recommendations. One of their and their commentary associated with it, they say that the current standards are very binary, and they really are. You either met the standards or you don't meet the standards. And when you look at other systems, it's more, I suppose, more of a graded system. So they're talking about using the quality standards in the health sector, but then you can be anywhere from very poor in terms of meeting that standard all the way to excellent. So this will just add, I suppose, another dimension, another bit of transparency, because again, I don't necessarily go out on my day-to-day job, but we, with our work with different clients, see that someone who meets the standard in one home can be very different in how that standard is met in another home. And I think it'd be good to have that transparency for the sector. And building on from quality, again, we expected that there would be some big recommendations around provider governance. I suppose it's a good time to also reflect on where the aged care sector is and where it's been in the past. Traditionally, it's been described as a bit of a cottage industry. We've got a lot of not-for-profit and community-based organisations, which many of them are very commercial in their operations and sophisticated, but there's also a large proportion of providers which are single site or very small package numbers, etc. So they don't have large scale. And what these recommendations are proposing is that we improve the governance of the sector and of providers. And this would be through a number of different lenses, but the ones that I want to touch on was really around increasing that reporting and disclosure requirements. So that's anything from finance, your financial liquidity levels, to your staff and staff turnover, to incidents, all of those things. We'd have a significant increase, which again, expected. With the findings from the recommendations, that's one big thing, is that they felt instances of, I suppose, things that had happened hadn't been reported on a timely basis, and we need to improve that to make sure that we can address those issues as soon as possible. The next is around improving the skills mix and structure of boards and key personnel, and I think this is going to be a really interesting one for the sector. Again, we're talking about a sector which is predominantly not-for-profit and community-based. A number of the people on the boards are volunteers in that instance, and what they're proposing is that they want to have, they want you to be able to demonstrate that that skills mix is the right skills mix for that organisation. But they're also talking about bringing people on that have clinical experience and make sure you've got that person on the board to provide that direction, and also introducing a clinical governance committee too. So this I think will be a big challenge for a number of providers. It's already really hard in any organisation to attract great personnel and to attract experienced directors, but an added complexity for your not-for-profits and for your community-based organisations that have to seek that on a volunteer basis. So I think when you start to think about these additional requirements, I think a lot of providers, if these recommendations do come through, will start to think about their longevity in the sector. And that's really enhanced by a couple of other recommendations around governance, which is about duty of care and the liabilities associated with that. So what the commissioners have proposed is that we introduce a duty of care for each approved providers, and that's around providing high quality and safe care to all care recipients. And if you breach that duty of care, there will be liabilities associated with that, and there's also the potential to attract civil penalties for key personnel, which would include the directors. So I think all of these big themes around provider governance are going to have quite a big ramification for consolidation in the sector when providers start to think, is this the game that I want to stay in? Am I the best person to be provider to be delivering care into the future? Then just a couple of elements. Obviously, there was a big focus again on workforce, very expected, I suppose, in terms of the recommendations that came through. And I think that was probably a theme or the general gist that I got when I was reading through these recommendations is a lot of these were very expected. It wasn't a lot of surprises. Yes, we knew that we're going to have increased training requirements. They want to be able to build a sector where people want to come into aged care. And at the moment, it is a bit of a challenge. A lot of people don't necessarily choose to be in the aged care industry. It's not sexy. So how can they make it a sector where people actually want to go there, want to work there? They have the professional development opportunities to stay and grow there. And a big part of that is around remuneration. So one of their recommendations is to start to align wages to be more in line with the health sector. And then the other recommendation is just around introducing a national registration scheme for workers. And this would be to set the minimum requirements around education and certification, training, police clearances and all the like. So that's one of the big recommendations there. And I think, you know, I'm not against that recommendation either. It'll actually probably help providers too. I'm sure you have to all go through the same process of making sure people have the right skills, and now you've got a national registration scheme, which might make that a little bit easier. And then finally, funding and financing. So how are we going to pay for all of these different recommendations that they're making? Well, what the commissioners are proposing is that we actually remove means testing for care services. I'll touch on this in a little bit more later. I find this a very interesting recommendation. I understand the altruistic thought behind it, in that it's a penalty. They don't want to penalise people, I suppose, for getting older and for needing care support services. But I think given the other direction of a number of their other recommendations, it almost goes against, you know, we're talking about a demand-based system, but then we're also having we're removing means-tested care fees. So I'll touch on it a little bit more, but just keep that in the back of your mind. The other one that they're also proposing to introduce is around case mix funding in residential aged care and care at home. they stopped it last year, but in residential aged care, they have been trialling a new funding model called ANAC, which is a case mix funding model. Don't ask me what it stands for because I forget, it's a long acronym. But they have always been wanting to get rid of ACFI. Well, for a long time, they've been wanting to get rid of ACFI. So we've known a case mix funding model is going to come through. We probably sit in the camp of not a huge supporter of case mix funding. One, I think it's already difficult in a residential aged care setting, but two, I think it's going to be very, very difficult in a care at home setting to be able to actually monitor and be able to collect the information to deliver and fund on a case mix basis. Case mix is traditionally the funding models which are used in hospitals, and it works great there. It has its own challenges there, but it's a lot easier to use in a hospital setting because you're talking about short length of stay, acute periods of time. You're talking also about them, being able to predict the journey that they're going on to. Then the next part is just around the independent body to price and cost care. So both commissioners have proposed that we introduce independent pricing authority, slightly different names because of the different systems that they're proposing. Briggs wants it to be a subset of the National Hospital Pricing Authority that already exists, whereas Pagoni would like it to be independent to that and be its own body. I think this is a really exciting part too, and does go hand in hand, I suppose, with the case mix funding model. For a long time, everyone in the sector has known that aged care is simply underfunded and that we need more funding to be able to deliver the quality of care that's expected. What this will do is hopefully be able to set and guide what that pricing should be and what that funding should be as well. The last area I just wanted to touch on, which links back to the means testing for care services, is just around they are proposing to fund and finance all of these recommendations through the introduction of a levy. They'd have slightly different ways of naming these levy. Pagoni would like it to be a hypothecated levy, so it's dedicated to aged care, whereas Briggs has proposed that it is a aged care investment levy. Either way you look at it, it's a tax. Now, in terms of what this would mean for the system, again, if I go back to that recommendation 25 and recommendation 1 around creating a new aged care program, which is needs-based, we need to get investment from the people that are also going to be consuming those services, because in the end, a levy is still going to be drawing money from the same bucket of funding, and you're going to end up still having to rationalise those services because that bucket of funding can only be so big if you're using your taxpayers as the base of that. So we would rather see, and hopefully in the response from the government, that we actually improve the level of means testing that's in the sector. We've done a few different studies on this, and we found that if you looked at what we currently contribute towards care services, we currently, the government currently funds more than 90% of care costs in home care and in residential aged care. If we could bring this down to, say, 75 to 80%, we could save billions of dollars, and that money could be reinvested back into the sector to improve the quality of services there. So that's one of the recommendations that we strongly oppose, but we'll wait and see what the government responds to with it. And I think that's where I'll just end, and I'm conscious of time, I always talk too much, but is where I'll end is about, I suppose, where the government response will be. We saw last week that their initial response was to chuck $500 million at the sector, and it's a great headline. We saw it all in the news on Monday and Tuesday morning, but when you actually unpack what that additional funding that they've allocated is, it's really just around regulation. So not even half of it is going to providers. So the government will either have one of two responses. They'll keep going down the path that they've started, which is to just chuck more and more money at the sector and not really implement any change. It'll just be very short-term increases in funding and an increase in regulation because they can pass that on to providers. But the other element is that they could go down the transformation, they could go down the recommendations which are made by the Royal Commission and start to transform the sector as we know it today. I think either way though, if the government kicks the can down the road a little bit longer, it doesn't matter too much as a provider because we know that the services that are delivered today need to change to be able to meet the needs and preferences of the consumers that are starting to come through. So if we can start to change our services and modify them so that they are transforming the experience that people will have when they go through the aged care sector, that's the path that I would go through. So don't hold your breath too much on what the government does because it's still going to be years and years away. Start to think about now what you can be doing to transform the aged care services that you deliver, or how you could position yourself to take advantage of all the opportunities that are presenting, not just from the Royal Commission, but from the position that we are in the sector at the moment. So I will end there and pass back to Emma.
I just want to say thank you, Amber. That was an amazing presentation and there's a lot to digest there. I'm going to introduce the panel now, and first, obviously, Amber, you're going to join the panel as well and contribute where you want to, obviously. So I'm just going to introduce the panel, tell you a little bit about them so you know who is presenting to you. First of all, I'm going to say Amber is a chartered accountant and director of Ansell Consulting. She's been responsible for various market feasibility analysis, service model development and financial modelling projects for providers and operators. She's also led a number of local and international strategic and diagnostic reviews, which has helped providers to develop and achieve their strategic goals. Amber's been instrumental in piloting several research projects in collaboration with peak Australian and New Zealand aged care industry bodies, including, but not limited to, delivering home care and retirement villages, a guide for operators with Property Council of Australia, and a research report, Home Care and Retirement Villages, with us as well. So you probably know why now we asked her to do the briefing on this topic. She's been pretty much living and breathing this for quite some time. The other panelists are Judy Coombs. She's also from Ansell Strategic. She's the manager of operations. She's a registered nurse, and a shout out to all registered nurses out there. I have a close affinity to them, and she has more than 25 years experience in aged care across clinical, quality and executive roles in Australia and New Zealand. You know, with her experience in operational strategy and change management, Judy has held key roles in advising providers on governance, quality and compliance. We also have Arthur Kumakelis, who's a partner in Thompson Gear's Aged Care and Retirement and Senior Living Communities practice. He's been an advisor in the sector since 1995, and no, Arthur, we're not going to do the calculations on that. And he's been consistently awarded Best Lawyer since 2011. He's advised on all aspects of operations and development and has appeared in major courts and tribunals on decisions affecting the industry. He's developed financial products for the industry and advised parties in Malaysia and Singapore in investing in these communities. We're also lucky to have Beverly Smith, Executive General Manager of Residential Communities Australian Unity, on the panel. She leads 1,300 employees, 21 retirement villages with over 2,500 ILUs and 7 aged care homes. Her experience and knowledge in this sector, as well as Australian Unity having their own home care, she's going to give us some very interesting insights on what she sees as the future, what future things will come out of this Royal Commission report. And to moderate the panel, we've kindly Helen Emerson, CEO of Southern Cross Care New South Wales and ACT, has agreed to moderate. She has also got 20 years experience in the aged care and disability services gained in both Australia and the UK. She'll be at the forefront of the transformation of aged care services and is very innovative in her approach. Before we start, I just want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to hand over to Helen now to commence the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Amber, for that amazing in-depth analysis of the recommendations. You did such a great job exposing and exploring the real highs and lows within both the report and the recommendations. To add to this rich discussion, I'm going to turn to my panellists now and using their in-depth experience, get their views and just go into a little bit more detail on certain areas. And where better place to start than with Arthur, who I know will, I'm going to give you a nice broad brush question, Arthur. With your years of experience as an advisor to the sector, what are your thoughts on the final report and recommendations?
Thanks, Helen, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. Amber laid the groundwork in relation to where the report is, but I think it's useful to think about where the government's already at in terms of its evolution, in terms of reforms. We've already got the evolution of ACFI into that new ANCAR form of funding. We've got reforms happening with home care. We've got discussion in relation to allocated places and the removal of those in residential aged care still out there with the government. We have a reform paper in relation to additional services sitting out there still with the government. And we also have a pricing. So the government is already doing some work in the background. This report, by presenting a split, has given the government, in my view, a really good opportunity to be able to thread the needle in relation to saying, well, you know, it's a bit of divergence. We can kind of pick up some levels here or pick up some themes there and be able to say, based on what we've been doing, we're on this path. As an overall response, in relation to this whole shift of home care and lack of means testing, you have to look at this commission as what it was stated to be, a policy report. The policy is going to be impacted by the government of the day seeking to adopt a policy, their own policy. So if you're a big government party, you go a big government kind of approach. If you're a small government, you might go the other way. My real reaction to the final report now is that it is almost like a baby boomer's manifesto. It is treating aged care as something which is a universal right, totally funded, just like Medicare, and there is just an open or undefined scope really as to what degree of support that goes to. It talks about social, it talks about home modifications, and yet it doesn't provide any boundaries. And looking at it as a baby boomer, you're saying that's fantastic because I get my home care, my aged care services paid for. That is great. From the other generational point of view, it doesn't seem so flash. Levies, taxes and the like. So in terms of the final report, I found that it actually lacked that sense of policy to balance equity, to balance current service delivery, to actually provide that sense of appreciation of what is actually going on at the moment. I get that it was a blank sheet, but I just sense that there was an opportunity missed. It doesn't explore how things, it didn't explore, and I think it missed its brief in relation to what it was asked to do. It didn't explain how aged care services are currently being provided in places such as retirement villages and how that's being addressed. So there's certain things that were missed. But overall, I think for the government's point of view, it provides them a great opportunity to thread the needle.
Thanks, Arthur. And look, you made that point, and Amber as well. Really, for me, the takeaway was it's going to be so interesting to see where the government's going to land with this. And I'm going to ask Judy on this one. What do you think the commissioners have been realistic in their recommendations, Judy? And do you think that any of those key recommendations will be achievable?
I think they've been aspirational. And in doing so, I think there is certainly a base there of a realistic approach of what's possible. I think the structure and governance aspects of the report are going to be particularly critical. You know, how we kind of build this new model and how it is, you know, enforced, and how the sector is supported to deliver to that level is going to be critical. So I think it gives us a really good blueprint. Are all of the recommendations able to be implemented and have the effect that they need to? Possibly not. But we've got some different opinions there, some different ideas, as Arthur said, and I think that will lead us down a really, you know, interesting path with some robust discussions, and you know, it'll be interesting to see what approach the government takes as a result of that. I think some of the interesting things around the governance aspects are, though, are we going to create too big an administrative layer with this, and is that going to draw too much away from the care of the elderly? So I think we need to really think about what's possible there and what's going to give us the greatest benefit in terms of that governance and structure.
Thanks, Judy. Bev, as a fellow operator, after this kind of 2-year wait of having this hanging over us like a bit of a black cloud, do you think it's what the industry was expecting?
Look, I think it did give a sense of rolling up that 2 years. So I think obviously over the period of the 2 years, the research, the community consultation, etc., was very thorough. So I think the report reflects that and covers a number of dimensions to it. I think, though, what it sort of took a step further was giving voice to the shifting expectations of consumers as the baby boomers and community. And I think things like the Flinders University research, you know, what people expect to pay, what people feel is a reasonable amount to pay for their care as they age, was also an important step forward in terms of articulating what that space could be. I guess from a provider's perspective, though, the big elephant in the room still remains around the funding and the financing model, both in terms of operationally and the cost of capital for new developments. And I think that those questions were largely left unanswered, as they have been time and time again. I share Amber's view around the means testing. I think that was an opportunity missed. And I think the research that was conducted during the Royal Commission, you know, overseas models, the Flinders research, did give an opportunity to look at that differently. And hopefully that is something that gets sort of picked up going forward. I think the thing from my perspective is, while this is positioned as a policy paper and looking forward in that respect, the baby boomers have reshaped every life stage that they have moved through, and moving into ageing will be the same. So we're going to see an interesting kind of confluence here between the policy position and settings and what consumers are expecting in terms of their experience, their choices, options as they age. And I think from my perspective, the consumer voice and the volume of people reaching this age will probably actually have more influence over what we do than many of the recommendations included.
Thanks, Bev. And yes, I agree. The financial aspects to the skeptics out there, it's not surprising that it was fairly unrealistic and underwhelming. But Amber, do you think there were any real surprises within the recommendations?
I think for me, the surprise was how unsurprising it was. We'd seen the report come out from the council assisting last year, which was pretty much a copy of what we saw in the final report. So no, not a lot of surprises from my end. I suppose I was surprised that the commissioners couldn't agree on some recommendations, because when you really go through them, they were just building upon each other. I don't know whether we have a bit of a conspiracy theory around whether people are positioning themselves for their next role after the Royal Commission is over. But I think as as a whole, it wasn't that surprising. We could see the angle that a lot of their research and that their hearings were taking were around creating this universal system, this utopian system, but it just, when unfortunately, I think as Arthur did touch on as well, they really missed the brief on, and as Bev touched on, that they missed the areas to research where these other systems are in place, particularly around that funding and financing element. We've seen universal systems being played out over in a number of other countries, and while they have worked to some extent, they're still facing that challenge now of they've got a declining taxpayer base, and how are they going to continue to fund at this level and this quality, because we've only got finite resources, and you've got to make a decision. Are we going to use that money for aged care, for health, for education, for infrastructure, etc.? There's only a certain amount of money in that bucket, and I think that's probably maybe not a surprise, more of a disappointment that they didn't look at how else we could better fund the system, which would deliver on and deliver that vision that they've created, which is to transform aged care.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, I agree. I'm an eternal optimist, but the term disappointment was something I definitely felt throughout the process and feel now. I want to turn our minds now a little bit to the impact on the retirement village sector and just pick up on a few things Bev had touched on. And as we know, to ensure an integrated long-term support and care to older people, the report recommends a National Cabinet Reform Committee for Ageing and Older Australians, a bit of a mouthful. The mandate for this committee includes ensuring there is appropriate housing. Bev, a bit of a topic close to your heart. Do you think we're going to start to see a real difference in RV models emerging in the sector now?
Look, I think we already are, and the thing for me is, you know, PwC runs the census for us every year, and you can already see models are diversifying, you know, more vertical retirement villages, more co-located retirement and aged care. So I think that will continue to proliferate. The Royal Commission did give a resounding support to the small household model in aged care, which is a nod to sort of smaller scale, more domesticated type models. And I think if you look at it, it's not all that different from retirement villages and retirement living. So I think older people wanting to live in a place where they can live with like-minded people, they feel a high sense of security and safety, and there are benefits around equity release or different types of financial benefits with that right sizing from the family home into RV are all very positive signals for this space going forward. And I think, you know, DMF is one model. We know that really that is supporting only about, you know, sort of 6 or 7% of the Australian target market of this age. What do the other 90 odd % look for? You know, we see land lease growing rapidly. So I think it's quite an exciting time for us to look at diversifying our models and our offerings for housing for older Australians, and actually giving some real thought to what those different models could look like.
Thanks, Bev. Arthur, obviously one of the big things with the recommendations is a new Aged Care Act, but what do you think the opportunities are for the Australian states and territories around retirement living? You know, there's a little bit disjointed, disconnect at the moment, especially around that purpose-built seniors housing. What do you think the opportunities are?
I think there's massive opportunities. It's rather, as I said, again, use the word disappointing. It's disappointing that as part of the report, they specifically have a heading there called out of scope, and they said that retirement villages were out of scope of this report. And I don't think they were out of scope, because the retirement villages deliver a large part of what we call aged care or home care services, domiciliary support of some description. The opportunity that exists is for a coordination between those kinds of services being provided in retirement villages, talking to the aged care services being referred to in this report, such as the domiciliary support, meals, preparation, that is, transport, social interaction, all those things we have in a retirement village, encouraging and saying, well, how do I get the care services to talk to the tenure in retirement villages in a more efficient manner to help develop those small home environments or those clustered environments they spoke about. There's a large chapter in the paper relating to getting the health services of each state to talk to aged care to be able to have that appropriate coordination. It's a logical thing to also take it to the forms of tenure retirement because it is a logical place where these services are delivered. So if the industry, I see it as a fantastic opportunity for the retirement village industry to look at this report and say, excuse me, you went from the home to residential aged care, you've missed this bit in the middle. Here's what we do to provide it. And what we need is the state governments to say, yes, that's a great thing to promote that development here in these states. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity if the industry presents it in a right way back to the government and the commission.
You're right there, Arthur. We've been looking at the different pathways in aged care and how that differs if someone's in the community and in a retirement living setting. And one of the really interesting findings from it is that you're less likely to end up in residential aged care if you're in a retirement living setting. It's just a perfect environment. It's already such a good sales pitch, and this is with the piecemeal system that we have today. And if we're able to improve that through some of the recommendations that are coming through the Royal Commission, we could start to deliver home care in a much better environment. We're already talking about a much more efficient environment to deliver home care services compared to if we're delivering home care services out to the wider community. And you've got the added benefits that you touch on about having that social support, having purpose-built housing as well. So 100% agree with that.
Just on the final point, so that I look at this report from the retirement perspective as in any business, you learn from the complaints that are given to you from your customers. So you learn from your customer complaints and what we can do better. This is the biggest complaints book with respect to the delivery of aged care services and home care I've ever read. So if you pick that up and say, well, hello, this is how we can address it, I think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's great. Great point. So I think the other elephant in the room really is the staffing. And we talk about the home care, and we know already that it is just near impossible to attract trained and skilled staff to the industry, let alone all the media bashing that we're getting. I'm not sure who really to address this question to, but I think maybe Judy, what do you think is the answer around staffing and the huge stats around the workforce we need going into the future?
I think we don't have a really good pipeline coming through, and we've acknowledged that for years. This report recommends levels for clinical care and clinical staff and personal carers. And as you say, we have a lot of difficulty getting, attracting the right calibre of person. And then we see even in the recommendations that it talks about, people who have lost their jobs because of COVID who could come into the sector. And I think this is an age-old problem that we are having, that people think that, if you can't make it somewhere else, go to aged care. And I just don't think that's the right message to be sending to potential workers. And certainly it's not the message to be sending to the consumers, to the people that we serve, to think that, if you, it doesn't matter who you are, you'll get a job in aged care and you'll be the one looking after me. I think the staffing issues are further, they are compounded by the revenue that we have, and that's nothing new to anybody. But I think the other aspect is understanding in the sector what is best practice, what do we expect the staff to be doing, how do we build the skills in people, and there are quite a number of recommendations around workforce training, skills, those types of things. But understanding even the current standards, there is a recommendation around revising the standards. I think we've got these standards and we need to actually build an awareness of what does the delivery of care look like in accordance with these new standards. And we had the situation before the standards were released where people thought it was a rehash of the old standards, and that was fraught with danger, that attitude. You know, if we get a new set of standards, I think we will be in exactly the same position as we were in 2019, where we had standards that people thought we're already doing that. I had a number of people say to me about the new standards, oh, our staff are kind and our residents are happy, so we meet the new standards. I think we need to do a lot more work on what does delivery of safe quality care look like based on these standards. And I think the sector, the regulators, we're not there yet in our understanding of what that needs to look like, what the skills are that people need to have, and what that, you know, in order to get those skills, what the training looks like. And we need the revenue to be able to do all of this. So I think there are building blocks that are already there that we don't want to throw away. I think we just need to understand what delivery looks like in this current context first, before we start adding in some new elements.
Thanks, Judy. And look, I agree wholeheartedly. We've got to get some positive public awareness that it's a great industry across the board. Bev, I'm sure you've probably got some comments to add to Judy's on this topic.
Look, I agree with the comments made. Workforce is the biggest challenge facing us as a sector, and I think we all know it and we've talked about it for a long time. But it does require that we get all components of the value proposition right. So when we're talking about attracting new people into the sector, we had the experience during the COVID outbreaks in Victoria where we were recruiting for surge workforce from other sectors. And, you know, we've actually recorded the feedback that we received from some of those individuals who were just blown away with how they felt about being able to work in aged care, how positive it was for them, that sense of being able to make a meaningful contribution, the sense of, it not being like all the stereotypes that they'd heard before. So I do think we have a perception issue, as you say, Helen, and I think we have to work very hard at a sector level to change that perception. But that's also got to show up in the practical things like what people are paid, like how people are trained, like people having a career path that extends beyond just their entry-level role. And that's why I think the work of the Workforce Council is really important to make sure that this gets due attention and focus to say you can actually have a really meaningful and rewarding career in this sector, and it can take you from that entry-level position up through team leader roles into management roles, and we should showcase those examples very proudly.
Agree wholeheartedly. As a registered nurse myself and someone that started work in a nursing home, agree wholeheartedly. And it's frustrating that we've been talking about this issue for years and years. I want to just again just come back and think about us as RV operators. And we know that in many jurisdictions at the moment, the Retirement Villages Act is under review. An issue often raised by operators is that of what rights do they have to get a resident to move to residential care when they are no longer safe or appropriate, which does happen. As much as we, you know, home care, we might want people to age in place. Sometimes people do need to move. I want to ask Arthur, and I guess it's just coming back to a bit of a legislative question. Do you think the legislation should stipulate the rights of the operator to facilitate this, to help us move residents to more appropriate accommodation care as required?
I mean, some jurisdictions already prescribe a mechanism to terminate on the basis of medical grounds where they are known, where for whatever reason the individual is unable to reside. New South Wales has a particular condition or right under the legislation. It's also generally dealt with in the village contract, which is to say we are an independent living environment and we're entitled to, where we consider you're unable to reside independently, we can ask you or we can seek to terminate your contract, and that's recognised in all jurisdictions of that contractual right. Question of enforceability against that. To your question as to whether it should be enforced, well, you have a fundamental problem in that currently, if you follow the logic of of where this report and reform is going, logically I can reside in a retirement village or any home until I reach a palliative state and in fact pass away, and I should be able to be supported. So it comes down to the question, definition of what does independent living mean, or does it matter anymore? And then it comes down to whether or not, I think it's taking on the probably the aged care definition of terminating security of tenure. That is, if I'm unable to provide the services that you require, then I can ask you to move to a location that does provide those services. So I think that's going to become the kind of test that legislators will need to look at. I don't think there will be a general right in legislation. It will definitely be part of the village contract, and it will require operators to kind of put that kind of language into their contract to say, look, this is what we do. Now that's the legal side of it. From my experience, when people in a retirement village reach a point where they are clearly lacking the capacity to live independently, my experience is that once you start that conversation with the family, the realisation does come into the minds of all concerned, and the person concerned does in fact move on to residential aged care in a more, somewhat not completely smooth way, but they do recognise the need to move on, and there is a support mechanism. So combination of village contract plus the support system that the retirement village operator has to assist them to move to the appropriate environment, I think work better than any legislative framework could possibly ever do.
Thanks, Arthur. Do you think the report, the recommendations, I mean, this is a bit of a broad brush question, and I'm thinking I'm going to pose this to Amber. Do you think the report and the recommendations will impact our present and future clients' views before they come into a village?
I think we're actually already starting to see the conversation change from prospective consumers and people that are coming through retirement living at the moment. In the past, I suppose the language that had been associated with retirement village was that word independent living, but now people are looking at as that alternative to downsize, as a place that they can go to still be part of the community. And I suppose in instances, we're also seeing the new models and new providers come through with these innovative programs which enable them to stay in place. So the examples, I suppose, Australian Unity, I know you're working on those programs, and obviously people are aware of the LDK model. We've got the Granton model here in WA, which is rolling out. But I think it will, for a positive benefit for the sector in terms of change the perception of what retirement living could offer to potential consumers. So that's, I suppose, where I see it moving as quite positive. And I think, Judy, you had, when you were working at ECH, a lot of your work was around, I suppose, having that community, because that was their whole mission, was to have people stay at home as long as possible. So I'm not sure if you would see it changing any more positively.
That's right. I think, there is this issue that older people now want to stay at home. There is the expectation that they will do that. This is vastly different from what we saw 20 and 30 years ago, where people became what I call social admissions to residential aged care. They had lost their spouse, felt they didn't want to live at home anymore, and came into care. And that's no longer the goal for people that we see. Certainly in our experience when I was at ECH, we found a similar pattern to what you're finding now, and that is that people who were in retirement living were less likely to go into residential aged care, and that was in the old system of home care, where it wasn't quite the consumer directed model that there is now. I think the risk that we see in retirement living and going down the path of some of these models is that we're going to further marginalise people who don't have the means to go into a retirement village. I think it's vitally important that we continue to see the not-for-profits really looking at social housing, how they can support people able to do that. I think this is a real risk of that we face in the future for these people, and there are recommendations around other marginalised groups like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, and how we can support them, as an industry, how we can support them to actually live out the goals that they have in their, last chapter of their lives. So I think this is a big issue that we need to come to grips with. We need to understand how the recommendations can support those people, but how we can set up the sector to also do that. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for us going forward.
It is a really important issue, that means part, because when you look at the statistics from residential aged care perspective, is that we always see the supported ratio level increasing, and it's not that the consumers coming through, or that that whole cohort and generation coming through is necessarily poorer, but it's often that we see that they're entering into residential aged care prematurely because they don't have any other alternative, and they can't afford the home care services to enable them to stay at home. And some of the research that we've looked at actually shows that, while I did mention before that in retirement living you're less likely to enter into residential aged care compared to if you're in a community, what we've actually also found is that if that retirement village setting is in a lower sociodemographic area, or has people with lower sociodemographic wealth levels, they are likely to have lower lengths of stay and more likely to enter into residential aged care. So I suppose it's, how can the sector address that problem, or position themselves to take advantage of that opportunity? Because Bev put it perfectly, we're only servicing that 7% of the market in retirement living. How can we make that grow more into that 90% of that pie?
Yeah, no, agree. Amber and Judy, you really hit the nail on the head with some of your points. And I'm gonna move to Bev now. And look, I think just one thing I want to talk about, as I think there's a real opportunity for that not-for-profits who are, speaking for my own organisation, we've done really what we've been doing for years is kind of, aged care housing in our villages. Bev, do you think there's an opportunity for the real traditional church-based not-for-profits, such as my organisation, to maybe partner or work with the newer RV providers?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is, the scale of the challenge ahead of us with the population numbers coming through is enormous, right? So it's going to require that we do think innovatively. We have a lot of existing assets. We're all challenged with workforce. We're all challenged with access to capital for redevelopments or new developments. I do think it's, how do we think more innovatively about that? And how do we ultimately focus on the core things that matter to people? Things like social connection are so important to an individual's well-being as they age. Making sure that there is access to timely and good quality care services. And yes, fundamentally, accommodation options in all various models is really important. So I think, how the sector kind of puts their heads together around this will be an important part of the solution. We're not just starting with a blank sheet of paper here. We actually have a lot of core assets and capability that we need to bring together in different ways going forward.
So how do you think we can do that? I mean, how do you think we've been talking for years in the sector about working better together? How do you think we can make it a reality, Bev?
Look, I think it's about how we start to come together as a sector and not necessarily relying on, Royal Commission reports or policy to drive the reform. I think that we understand our marketplace very well. We understand changing consumer expectations. We understand challenge with workforce. I think it's about organisations coming together to say, how might we solve this particular problem in this particular, geographical area? I think we've got to bite it off in sort of reasonable chunks, but it is organisations of like-minded people coming together to solve for that. I don't think that there is any other way. I don't think government's going to arrive with extra billions and billions of dollars. I think we've got to find ways to think about the solution differently, and that's people getting together to solve for it.
Absolutely, rise up and above. Emma, what do you think where do you see the Property Council fitting in with this and assisting the sector?
Look, I think the Property Council's got a very important role in advocating and educating all tiers of government about where the retirement living sector can support these reforms. I know Ben has already had a conversation with the Federal Minister's Office about it. One of the issues that he raised in relation to the recommendation about where they're saying that there should be a grant fund for modifications to the family home. What we're saying is that, you know, the government needs to promote and encourage right sizing, getting people out of the family homes, and if they're going to give money for modifications, which, you know, may only be required for a short period of time and obviously will, you know, be torn out when new people move in, that they should give grants to these people to incentivise them to come into retirement living communities. The other thing that I think that a recommendation that we hope will be implemented is the recommendation for a sort of a national cabinet committee, aged care committee, where there's an integrated approach between governments, you know, for the recommendations. And one of the things that they'd be looking at is ensuring that there's appropriate housing options for seniors. This we would really love to see, because we'd really like to see a higher prioritisation from, I suppose, state planning ministers and their departments for retirement living, basically. Something that we do struggle with. There's certainly obstacles in all jurisdictions in relating to planning for seniors housing. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Emma. We're going to wrap up now. I'm going to go to Amber, really come back to kind of where we started, and Amber, just after your session and then hearing the panel's views, was there any last comments you wanted to make?
I think it's probably just building on a bit about what everyone's touched on, is that the recommendations and the reports that have come out from the Royal Commission really do paint a bright future for the retirement village setting. You've already got the right product there, and many people and many providers are already starting to move towards improving the service delivery, the accommodation offering, and starting to change the narrative of who of what their service offering is. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity for providers to build on what is in this report, utilise it to transform the service that you're delivering today. And not necessarily, we're not talking about replacing residential aged care. We think there's always going to be a purpose for that, but this can almost be a real core part of the aged care system going forward. And we think that we should go down that path, follow some of these, as Arthur pointed out, these complaints, and think about how we can address that and take advantage of all those different opportunities that are presented there.
So we'll wrap it up there. That was an extremely interesting panel discussion, and I actually hope that we've recorded it, because I wouldn't mind watching it all again, to get all the points that you guys have raised. I suppose now it's a wait and see approach to see what the federal government, how the federal government will respond. Hopefully we'll get our first hints in the upcoming federal budget to see which way they're going to pivot on it. Thank you all, everyone, for attending. Yeah, I hope that the information today that we provided today was worthwhile and beneficial, and gave you a better understanding of where the recommendations of the Royal Commission are up to. Look, and we're hoping, as I said, retirement living, we're really well placed to benefit from this, and that's, as we said, the role of the Retirement Living Council and the Property Council to ensure that our voice is being heard as these recommendations are being implemented. Just on to another thing, we've got an awards, Retirement Living Awards reminder. The nominations for the 2021 National Retirement Living Awards will open next week. So nominate early and often. If you'd like more information about the awards, head over to the website retirementlivingawards.com.au. And again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our speakers, Amber Cartwright, Judy Coombe, Helen Emerson, Arthur Kumakelis and Beverly Smith. Thank you so much for your time this morning, particularly for the ones in WA. I know it was early and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you online again soon on another membership briefing.